You know, I love when we have a chance to book Karl Rove on this show, because booking Karl, even though he's a good tribute and a valued one, he's kind of like booking Elvis. A lot of shows compete for his services and insight. He's a brilliant writer, great analysis. But, you know, the message from the Karl Rove people is you're going to have to stand in line. I got a lot of people back behind you who want to come there. So I won the lottery today. He's with us, Karl Rove. Good to see you, my friend.
Wow, thank you so much.
Oh, you're
Look, I'll be on any time you want me to be on.
Yeah, we'll see about that. Seriously, Karl, I did want to pick your brain a little bit. I enjoyed not only reading your Wall Street Journal pieces and all, where you kind of zig while others zag, and that's probably an understatement, but what's at stake here as these primaries kick off in the next few weeks and months, particularly in Ohio tonight? President Trump has backed J.D. Vance, who kind of came out of nowhere. They've had a bit of a tenacious past, but all's forgiven apparently, and the support is on. These are big tests, including Georgia pretty soon, where he's backing former Senator Perdue against the incumbent governor, Brian Kemp. How much of this will be a test of whether we get a Trump bump?
I think a lot of it will be a test. And look, it's not going to be uniform everywhere, and the president's going to have a bigger impact in some contests than he has in others. But let's take a look at Ohio. There was a poll that came out of the field literally the day before the president endorsed. He endorsed on Friday, April 14th. J.D. Vance was at 23. Josh Mandel was leading at 28. State Senator Matt Dolan was at 12. Businessman Mike Gibbons was at 14. Former state party chairman Jane Tipkin was at 8. The Real Clear Politics average as of today is Vance up at 26. Mandel has dropped 5 points to 23. Dolan has nearly doubled to 22, in large part because he is running a gigantic TV blitz talking about his agenda. And Gibbons at 15, Timken at 7, essentially flat. So what we're seeing is that this did not consolidate, at least thus far. It did not consolidate everybody. You know, Mandel dropped, but Dolan rose by more than Vance did. So we'll see how it comes out tonight. But it is clear the winner of this primary, with 7 candidates in the race and 5 of them being significant, this may be won with as little as 30 or 32% of the vote. And it's going to be interesting to see how big a bump there was between the 15th of April to wherever Vance ends up tonight.
You know, I'm just curious, looking ahead to the Georgia race, what you make, Karl, if Governor Brian Kemp survives all that, with the attacks on his saying the 2020 election was legitimate, and he's up by double digits last time I checked, so you know this better than I, that could be maybe a reminder that, and again, you say all these races are confined to those states, I get that maybe this, you know, fight to redo 2020 is done. We're on to 2024. What do you think?
I think that's true. And look, this is not that we don't need to wait until Georgia, which is the 24th of the month. We're going to have in a week, we're going to have an election in Idaho where Trump has endorsed the sitting lieutenant governor against the very popular incumbent Republican governor, Brad Little. And every poll shows Brad Little up by a significant margin. I think he's going to win and win handily. And again, even tonight, let's just assume for a minute that Vance does win tonight in Ohio. Let's say that he gets, say, 32% of the vote, which is up 9 points from where he was before the president endorsed him, or at least in the last poll before he endorsed him. That still means that close to 7 out of every 10 Ohio Republicans have said, you know what, I'm not going with the president's choice. And that's a pretty strong commentary. Yes, his endorsement is, if Vance wins, it will be because of the president's endorsements. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. But on the other hand, what about those 7 out of 10? That, you know, those were people, many of whom were strong Trump people, who now say, wait a minute, I had a choice. He stepped in. He didn't listen to me. And there's going to be a lot of hurt feelings around. I frankly don't understand why President Trump has endorsed so many candidates in so many races in the face of a lot of support from his people inside the state for other candidates. We had a county chairman and the delegates to the Republican National Convention from Ohio in 2016 write a letter to the president saying, we were with you since the beginning. Why are you doing this?
That's a very good point. You know, I'm curious to get your take on the Supreme Court maybe poised to strike down the Roe v. Wade in its draft opinion, whether it's true or not. The Supreme Court Justice John Roberts has indicated that is a legitimate draft opinion, but that it doesn't guarantee the final outcome. Having said that, it seems to be the political equivalent of a Hail Mary pass opportunity for Democrats to galvanize their base, and they're not wasting a nanosecond, nor the push maybe to get legislation going to enshrine abortion rights in the law. What do you make of the difference it could make in the midterms?
Well, it can make a difference in some states, in some races, particularly for the state legislature. Remember, we have 18 states that have laws on the books that if Roe v. Wade is overturned, guarantee state-level abortion rights. And we have 13 states in which there are varying levels of restriction on the books that will come into force if Roe v. Wade is tossed out, which means there are 19 other states, excuse me, 20 other states. You have to count the District of Columbia. It's one of the jurisdictions that does have abortion rights in local law. So we got another 20 states where it will become a bigger battle than in the rest of the country. But yeah, this is an advantage for the Democrats in generating enthusiasm. How big an advantage? I'm a little skeptical. Look, but if I were the Democrats and they're doing badly on the inflation, the economy, the world, immigration, crime, wokeness in education, I'd be wanting to talk about anything other than those things.
But this notion that people might have sat out this race, maybe some, not enthusiastic Democrats, even some independents, nationally, does it make a difference?
I think it might in some states and some locales, but again, it's going to require the Democrats to make abortion rights the center of their effort. And let's game that out. Let's say you have a Democrat who says, my number one issue is we need to restore abortion rights in our state, and I'm running for Congress or I'm running for the state legislature, and this is going to be my top priority. And their Republican opponent says, you know what, I've got views on abortion, and here's what they are, but the number one issue is doing something about inflation, and the number two issue is doing something about the economy, and number three issue is doing something about immigration, and number four issue is doing something about standing up to Russia and China. I think that argument's going to go a different way than some of the people might think today.
I know you weigh on political matters, but corporations weigh into these things whether they like it or not. And maybe given what happened to Disney in Florida, some might be more reluctant to do so. But Yelp is reacting to this, the food and delivery restaurant booking service, saying that overturning Roe versus Wade will jeopardize the human rights of millions of women who stand to lose the liberty to make decisions over their own bodies. Turning back the clock on the progress women have made over the past 50 years will have a seismic impact on our society and economy. I could go on, but the gist of that is that this was a big mistake. But no matter where corporations weigh in on this, liking it or hating it, I'm just wondering, in a 50-50 country, I know people argue over the numbers here, pro-choice versus pro-life, what's the impact of that? And companies that weigh in?
Well, yeah, look, in this instance, they sound like they're out of touch with ordinary Americans. I was taken by, I think it was the most recent Wall Street Journal poll, 48% of the people supported a ban on abortion after 15 weeks. That's the Mississippi law. And 47% opposed it, or 44%, excuse me, opposed it. So we have nearly half the American people supporting one of the strictest abortion laws in the country. Well, the science has given us a look into this issue that is deeper and more complicated than it was 40 or 50 years ago. And as a result, Americans' opinions have become more nuanced, and they're willing to say women ought to have a right to choose, but we also accept the fact that there ought to be limits on it. And after 15 weeks or 20 weeks or 25 weeks, people shouldn't be going and getting an abortion. It's destroying a human life. So this is not an easy issue for one side or the other to deal with, and as a result, it's not going to have the huge benefit the Democrats some Democrats think it might have, but I know why they're doing it, and we all know why they're doing it, because they're losing on the other issues that are dominating the agenda, starting with inflation, where their party's leader has got approval ratings on inflation in the high 20s, which means that over half the people who voted for him say, or almost half the people who voted for him say, I think he's doing a lousy job on the number one issue facing the country.
Finally, Karl, I'd be curious, before we go, your thought on the 2024 race and whether Republicans emerge to challenge Donald Trump, assuming he runs, including Ron DeSantis? Or are some of them so convinced of their own stature, maybe including Governor DeSantis, that it's open season and they're going to try regardless of whether the former president is in it or not? What do you think?
I think there are going to be candidates who get into the race and get into the race early because there's no guarantee that President Trump runs. And if he does run, there's no guarantee necessarily that he wins. I think this year, I think things like endorsing Vance and endorsing, I mean, look, Mo Brooks in Alabama, he endorsed him early, turned out to be such a dreadful candidate that he withdrew the endorsement. But there are going to be others, like the lieutenant governor in Idaho and Governor Kemp, David Perdue in Georgia, who come up short, thereby weakening the hold that Donald Trump has over the Republican Party. I don't think he took that into consideration when he decided that he was going to do something that nobody has ever done before as a former president, and that is get themselves involved in so many contentious primaries around the country.
Yeah, a grudge can go a long way to actually backfiring. Karl Rove, great seeing you. You are the Elvis of all things politics, and we appreciate you stopping by.
You bet. Thank you, sir.